Hi, my name's Vincent Sheehan and I'd like to talk to you about Mahler's Sixth Symphony with a particular focus on the musical structure of each of the four movements, and I will play some musical examples to accompany this analysis. But just before we go to that, just a few words about the context in which the symphony was written. It was composed between 1903 and 1904 and it was revised a few years later as well. Mahler had just got married to Alma. They were expecting a child as well while this symphony was composed. So it must have been a happy time in Mahler's life. Despite this, the work is very dark in tone. Indeed, it has the nickname the Tragic Symphony. And a lot of the music is supposed to say much about Mahler's own life. Famously, there are these massive hammer blows in the finale, which are supposed to represent the blows of fate or the successive tragedies in Mahler's life after the symphony was completed. Whatever you think about that, about this kind of prophetic sense in the music as well, it's very interesting. You can read about that online. There's plenty of information. What's less accessible is analysis on the music itself, and if you're anything like me and you enjoy following the structure of music, particularly classical music, I hope that this video will be helpful. So let's start at the beginning. The symphony's in four movements. It's in A minor, and the first subject is in a very regular sonata form. The exposition's even repeated, so if you miss out some of the details the first time round, you could pick them up the second time. The symphony opens with, or the movement opens, the first subject is a grim march, goes something like this. And then we come to what's probably the most important idea in the whole symphony. It's a rhythmic idea, almost a military tattoo, and it's supposed to represent fate itself. Indeed, it actually returns right at the very end of the symphony. It goes like this. Notice the alternation between major and minor. That's like a fingerprint. It's very distinctive in this symphony, so listen out for that. We then come on to a transition theme to bridge the first and second subjects. And it's a chorale in the woodwinds. It's like this. And that leads us to the second subject, which is a love theme, very passionate. Indeed, it's always been called the Alma theme, and it goes like this. And that takes us to the end of the exposition. As I said before, the whole thing's repeated to add clarity to this sonata form movement. We then move into the development, as you'd expect, and the ideas we've heard already are broken down, as any great composer would, into their rhythmic and intervallic components. What's special about this development, though, is in the centre of it there's this wonderful moment when we're transported to another world. We suddenly hear these cowbells and we're almost kind of taken to an alpine hillside, and it's very calm, but it's also slightly unsettling. We hear the transition theme, which is kind of mutated by now, on the celesta and the horns, and it really is a very memorable moment in the symphony, the still heart of this movement perhaps. Eventually we get to the recapitulation. We hear the first subject again, that march, boom, 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 da da dum, and so on and so forth. We hear the transition again. The transition this time is twice as fast, perhaps Mahler's saving a bit of time here. Then we hear the Alma theme again, but this time it's not so direct. It's kind of refracted, it's diffused, it's not so direct this time. And there's a good reason for that, because Mahler saves this theme for right at the very end of this movement in the Coda, where we hear it in all its kind of glory. And this movement, indeed, you could argue, ends on a note of hope rather than despair. That brings us on to the second movement. Now, there's some debate about what the second movement should be in the symphony. Some people think the Scherzo should be the second movement. Some people think the Andante, the slow movement, should come next. I think Mahler was not, it's not clear about Mahler's intentions, but whatever performance you see, whether it's the Andante first or the Scherzo next, there's arguments for both sides. I'm going to talk about the Scherzo next, simply because it's next in my score. And the Scherzo is in A minor again. It's similar in tone actually to the first movement. And it begins with this dance tune, very dark, which I'm going to call section A. It goes like this. Section A. Then, as you'd expect, there's a trio. The trio is a Ländler, which is common in Mahler's symphonies, like this Austrian dance. But this is different because it's kind of off kilter. It's in an unusual meter. It's in a 7, which would make it a very difficult Ländler to dance to. Apparently, this is supposed to represent Mahler's children tottering on the seaside. I'm not sure how true that is, because I think he did have a child by now, but she would have been very young. So, but nevertheless, it does give a sense of this kind of uneasy motion in this this tune. It goes like this. At the end of this trio, of this, what I call the B section, we have this additional idea, kind of a closing idea, which is this slidey, Eastern influenced tune. Not significant perhaps to be regarded in its own, as its own section, but memorable nonetheless. It's like this. It's on the oboe, I think, you hear it first of all. Then we go back to A. We return to B again. This time it's varied. The orchestration's different. The key's different. Then we go back to A again, and we finish with a coda. The next movement is the Andante, the third movement, or the second movement, depending which performance you see. And it's a set of double variations, similar to the third movement in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, where you have two contrasting themes, and every time they're presented, they're varied. The first theme, which I'm going to call A, is a beautiful melody. It goes like this. Listen for that every time it comes back. In contrast, we hear on the cor anglais, first of all, a rather more mournful melody, which I'm going to call B, goes like this. So listen out for that. There's another idea as well, which sometimes gains prominence over that in this B section, which goes like this. And in some restatements of this section, the B theme, that you hear that more than the mournful idea. You can see the structure in the description down underneath. It's A, B, A1, B1, A2, B2. B2 is in the major, incidentally, and then we go back to A3 to finish this movement off. That brings us on to the finale, which is a huge movement and a rather marvellous piece of music in its own right. This is where the heart of this symphony is, I believe. And it took me a long time actually to work out what was going on in this piece structurally. But essentially it's in sonata form, like the first movement, but there are these interludes put between the sections of the symphonic argument, which makes this music very original actually, structurally. We begin with this lengthy introduction and we hear this wonderful evocative splash of colour. We hear this very deep note, I think it's a C on the contrabassoon, then this splash of celesta and harp and these cymbals, and we hear this this melody on the first violins. So on, and at the end there we have the repeat of this fate motif, if you remember this from the very beginning of the symphony. After that we hear what will coalesce into the main ideas of this sonata form movement, but in a very embryonic form. So we hear these murmurings of what will become the march idea of the first subject and of the second subject. The first subject proper is a march similar to the march in the first movement. It goes like this. And that's followed by an extension idea with these wide-ranging intervals. Then we have the second subject, which is this rather heroic sounding idea. We hear it on a horn first of all, and it's like this. If anything's a contrast to the tragedy, which is always threatening to pull this work down, it's an idea like that. After the exposition, we hear similar music to the very opening of the introduction, and this is an interlude. This is one of the interludes I was talking about, which is kind of placed in between the joins of this symphonic argument. And the interludes share similar music to the introduction. We hear this idea again, which we heard in the introduction, this melody on the first violins. And then that's quite short this time. The development then starts to break in. And on the cellos we hear rumblings of the first subject. The development is huge, and it's marked by these two great waves, both with huge climaxes on top of the crest of these waves. This is where we hear the two hammer strokes. So listen out for those. They're truly wonderful moments, and if you ever get to see this symphony live, look at the percussion section here, because you'll see some guy there with a massive hammer smashing it down. And if you look on YouTube, there are some clips of people doing that, so have a look out for that. Wonderful music. Eventually we get to the another interlude just before the recapitulation. The interlude has similar music again to the introduction and the first interlude. It's like, these are like kind of marker points in this movement. Structurally they're very important. They keep bringing us back to this kind of this idea. We then have the recapitulation. We have the return of that march theme. We have the second subject. And actually, what's interesting about this recapitulation is the order's reversed. What happens is the second subject comes first. Da 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 da. We hear that first. Then we hear the first subject. So the order's reversed in the recapitulation. That brings us to a codetta, which brings us to the coda. And the coda again is based on this idea, these ideas from the introduction, which we've heard in the interlude before the development and the interlude before the recapitulation. And this coda, we hear the sweep of the celesta and this low note, the contrabassoon, the sweep of the celesta, the harps and the cymbals. And this always gives me a kind of a rather metallic, bitter taste in my mouth when I listen to this music. There's a hollowness to it as well. There really is a kind of a pitch in the stomach when you listen to this music. It's, in a way, it's rather sick, I think. And the coda kind of eventually ebbs and ebbs and ebbs, and we get to a very quiet dynamic indeed. And then right at the very end of the symphony, perhaps the most terrifying ending to a symphony I've heard, we hear the whole orchestra thunder out that fate motif again. And this time there's no major, it's all minor. Now obviously that does no justice to the power of this music at all on the piano, but it is truly terrifying, and it always makes me jump when I hear that. I hope that this video has been helpful, and I hope that it enhances your enjoyment and appreciation of this wonderful symphony. Thank you for watching.